Welcome to the Living Nondual. Today's video is in response to a few questions I got from my first postings, and something I wanted to get to eventually here, just because it's an essential part of any communication on non-duality. It'd be useful for anyone talking on non-duality to give their impression of how to explain it to anyone who wasn't familiar with the concept, or at the very least give the viewer a sense of what I mean when I say non-duality, and why it's a meaningful thing to communicate, or a meaningful perspective to have. Put simply, it is the understanding that all of creation is unitive. In other words, the things that we perceive or understand as different parts, as separate, quote, things in the universe, don't exist in ultimate reality. That all of creation is a unity. You might call it oneness. That's referred to as oneness quite often. I use the term non-duality in these communications, and I use it in conversation because the idea of oneness misses the mark for me just slightly, in that when one says oneness, one could understand that they're referring to a thing, like there is one thing. And the reason why that misses the mark, at least slightly, is because then if there's one thing, then there is a possibility that there might be some other thing as well. But the whole point is that all of creation is a unity. And the term non-duality is meant to convey the idea that there are not two things. And because there are not two things, you can infer that everything is a unity. All those things that are apparent things are part of a unity. And that has implications that are not apparent when you first encounter the phrase, or first encounter the term non-duality. First, the idea that each of us is not a separate being, that we don't have an individual existence in the way we've understood it all our lives, the way the culture that each of us is brought into. And I'm not talking about the culture in the United States of America. I'm talking about pretty much any culture around the world that understands individuals as separate beings, and that their cosmology and spiritual and religious underpinnings take that as a given, that each of us is an individual. They're just massive implications of that. And I think the first of which is the idea that each of us has individual needs that need to be met, and by virtue of that, do all sorts of things to have their needs met, whether individually or in groups, because there's not an understanding that there is a unity across all of creation, and two, by virtue of that unity, each of the apparent things in the universe is sufficient unto itself, because it is all life expressing, and life is sufficient to itself. The other thing that is important to convey here is that, just looking at other explanations of non-duality that I've seen expressed on the internet, just looking at myself there, there's quite often a lack of comparing non-duality with duality, right? So, in part because the dualistic perspective or the way of looking at the world through the dualistic lens is so pervasive and seemingly obvious that I think most people think there's no point in explaining it. So I'll take a moment to talk about duality in the sense, as a way of contrasting it to non-duality. As I mentioned earlier, I think as each of us emerges into understanding each of ourselves as an individual being, we take that as a given, that because we have apparently separate physical beings, apparently separate physical attributes, apparently individual thoughts, feelings, actions, emotions, it's just obvious that there are more. I mean, you can just look at every object around you. You can see those objects as distinct, and quite often you can pick them up and move them. It's so obvious that there are separate things in the universe. So the idea that there is duality is not questioned. In addition to that, the process of education and acculturation cements that notion and makes it, and because everyone around you adheres to that belief, that understanding of the nature of the universe, there's just no question, no reason for you to question it. Now, throughout history, there have been people who have either declared themselves to be, or others have declared them to be, either enlightened or awakened. And those special people are deemed to have some attributes of their separate self that enable them to see through this veil of separate dualistic thinking. And one of the things that is emerging in this time on the planet, I am convinced that this is true, and I consider myself a part of it, is that the understanding of ourselves as not separate beings, but as expressions and emanations of the unity of creation, is something that will be not just understood and not just awakened to by most of us. It will become the prevailing understanding of the universe. And when that becomes the case, then the peace and happiness that I think all of us, not so much strive for, but all of us understand to be the truth of the universe, I guess you could say in our souls, can potentially bring itself into being in this apparently manifest environment. So why non-duality? Why talk about it? Why make it an important part of my life? And also, why be public about this understanding? It's because I'm convinced it is the fundamental ground of creation. And that being the case, our actions as apparently separate beings that are in harmony with that fundamental ground of creation creates a kind of synergy that propels us further and further into that awareness, which I'm convinced has many, many layers. There's not simply one step of awareness on which all of us we're all of us on one side of it, and then suddenly we become on the other side of awareness. I'm convinced that this is an understanding that is part of that is the fundamental nature of who each of us is, and that we are simply not awake to it. And awakening to it is less like the typical awakening when you awaken from a slumber. Well, actually, maybe it is. Now, as I say that, maybe quite often, yes, you are awakened suddenly, but it's not uncommon to awaken gradually, and your senses kind of come online in what appears like some period of time, as opposed to it happening all at once. So you could imagine the awakening to our larger self, to our true selves, as a either happening suddenly in some cases, or I believe in my case, it happens over a period of time, but it's not. I'm convinced that as it becomes more and more common, that we won't understand it as extraordinary at all. We'll understand it as a fundamental attribute of life, and as the work that I've referred to before, the Conversations with God refers to it, is that oneness is not a property of life. Life is a property of oneness. And in saying that and embracing that idea, it's easy to understand that if that is true, if there is a truth to that, and it's an accurate statement, then that we don't have a clear understanding of it in this current form, in our current way of thinking, could yield over time, very gradually, to a very clear understanding of it. And it doesn't need to be considered mystical, doesn't need to be considered extraordinary. It's simply what is so. And simply an understanding of that can emerge, and either suddenly or gradually, but it needn't be extraordinary. It's just it is just what is so, and coming into that will enable this experience, as limited, even in this limited form, to enable greater and greater expressions of the divinity among all of us. So, non-duality. Non-duality is the perspective, the understanding that all of creation is a unity. There's a unity across all of creation. The apparent separate aspects of creation are just that, apparently separate, and that each aspect, each facet of creation all belongs to the same ground of unity, of non-duality. Thanks.